It's very interesting that in England we don't have very many gay writers. I can think of perhaps 5 male gay novelists. Philip Hensher, Alan Hollinghurst, Paul Burston, Deary Osman, Paul McVeigh, Damien Barr, Patrick Gale. That's not a lot, considering, there are thousands of novelists there. And in terms of, lesbian novelists or writers, Dorothea Smart, who's a poet, a Bajan British poet, Joelle Taylor, who's a performance poet, Jackie Kay, who's a poet and novelist, Ali Smith, Jeanette Winterson. Does she write on gay themes? So, but the thing is, I suppose the point I'm making is when we perhaps even know them personally and can name them, that means that we have an issue with people writing beyond heterosexual sexuality. And what's very interesting is that the Penguin publishers, who are my publishers, I don't know if you've heard, they've got a new scheme, a fairly new scheme called Right Now, where every year they take on between 10 and 12 new writers of fiction and non-fiction who are writing from communities that aren't normally represented in publishing, which essentially means writers who are of colour, who are disabled, who are coming from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, and who are coming from different sexualities. And they've brought on so far, I think, about 22 new writers who are being mentored to publication. Hopefully they'll all be published, probably by Penguin. And I think this is going to completely revolutionise publishing, because Penguin, it's now called Penguin Random House, is the biggest publisher in Britain and possibly one of the biggest in the world. So it's a major mainstream publisher who are taking on all these kinds of what we would have called years ago alternative voices. So today we have, I think most of you will probably have been here since yesterday or the day before. So we have Sabrina Mahfouz, who's an Egyptian English, and she writes about sexuality, and her last poetry collection, I'm really bad at titles, but it's How You Would Know Me. How You Might Know Me, is a book in which she ventriloquizes sex workers, and she writes about sex in it, but she also explores sex and sexuality in her other work. We've got Paul McVeigh, who was reading last night, of course, writing about a boy in Belfast growing up who everybody else thinks is gay, but he hasn't become aware of that himself. And then we have Monique. If you missed Monique yesterday, was it yesterday? It really feels like so long ago. She's written several novels, but she's also written an erotic novella, which she read from, and also a memoir with the kisses of his mouth, which is an incredibly erotic sort of journey of self-discovery into sexuality and healing and her psyche and so on. And it's quite amazing to read in terms of the subject we're discussing today, which is sex and sexuality. There's also the issue of how much sex we're allowed to write, or how much, when I say that, I mean how much sex is published in books, what the culture is for writing sex in British literature. Do we do it? How much do we do it? I think you certainly got some views on this. So I think what I'm going to begin with is to ask each panelist to sort of speak to the subject. And then perhaps quite quickly we'll open it up to you. So start thinking about things you might want to say, so that the experience is interactive. Often when we ask if anyone's got any questions, there's this silence, and then one hand tentatively goes up. But I think it's a much better experience for all of us if we too hear, and everybody else hears, your views on the matter, as writers, as academics, and definitely as readers. So I'm going to begin with Sabrina.
Okay, right, well, I worked in strip clubs throughout university, so at that point I didn't think I was going to be a writer. Obviously no one really thinks they're going to be a writer, I guess, but for the majority of time that I was working in strip clubs, I was a waitress, and as a waitress, your task was basically to stand along the wall, dressed in not usual waitressing outfits, as you can imagine, basically in like corsets and stockings and stuff, with a tray, constantly with the tray at the ready, and your order pad and your pen, because there was not a very high-tech situation happening in these places. And I did that for like 5 years, and I was constantly taking notes on my little order pad. So I've still got them now, like, and on the receipts and stuff. So it'll be like 5 bottles of Cristal equals £7,000, and well, it wasn't actually that much. But then there'll be like my little poem at the bottom, which, yeah, I don't know, it's funny. So I guess my writing was always orientated around sex, like not the actual act of sex, but the transaction of the promise of sex initially, because although people who worked in strip clubs did actually sell sex, that was officially not allowed in the strip club. So it was much more about the promise that sex with this woman was possible if you paid enough money, or that in another world she would have liked to have sex with you, I guess. So yeah, I started, when I first decided to do poetry, I just took those notes that I'd made and made poems out of them. And I guess in a way it was like audience led me to keep writing about sex, because the poems that I did that weren't about sex did not go so well. So I thought, right, okay, people like the sex stuff. Let's stick with that. And because I was doing performance poetry, an audience reaction is extremely important. It is like everything, which is not necessarily the best way into writing, because you're not writing necessarily for yourself. You are most definitely writing for your audience. That could also be considered a good thing. I don't know. But yeah, so I found that audiences loved hearing about sex being spoken about, whether that was in a horrible, awful way, whether that was in a funny way, whatever. They loved it. And then I was obsessed with it as well, I think, because I was just really trying to untangle what I made of the sex industry, what I made of my position within that sex industry, whilst also starting to discover very late sort of various feminist organisations and sort of aligning myself with them and figuring out what I was allowed to think about the sex industry, but also be campaigning for all this other stuff that other people who were campaigning for that thought that you couldn't do that and have worked in the sex industry. So I don't know, it was all really complicated. So writing about that sort of sexual stuff was in some way helping me look at my political views through sex. So that is my beginning ramble, and I'm now going to pass over.
That wasn't a ramble, it was really interesting. But can I just ask you, because you mentioned earlier a play you did called Offside, which was exploring somebody's sexuality in the 1920s. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so my first 4 plays, they were all about sex workers in some way. I didn't even realise I was doing that, but I was. And then when it got to the point where other people could ask me to write plays for them, they weren't usually about sex. And this one, in particular, Offside, which I co-wrote with Holly McNeish, who's a British performance poet, was about women's football in England specifically, in the UK actually, more generally. And one of the most famous women footballers, Lily Parr, she's the first woman that was ever in the Football Hall of Fame. She scored like 1,000 goals in the 1920s. And Lily Parr was a open lesbian. She lived with her female partner, who used to come to matches, and they would kiss and stuff in public, and it wasn't really commented on as nearly as much as how inappropriate it was for women to be playing football. So I find that really interesting, and the fact that she was kind of remembered as a footballing hero, but not necessarily remembered as a lesbian woman, which I guess in a positive sense could be like, well, because why should it matter? But in a less positive sense, it could be because people have tried to like keep that under wraps a bit. And so I just loved having this character from a time where people believe, inaccurately, that no LGBT lives were in public, especially women, and there she was, this very public figure, living in that way. So it was just, we didn't concentrate on it at all. It was just in the scenes where she had her partner there. Her partner was just there, and they would embrace and they would discuss, and it was just, being able to put that there was good.
Okay, great, thank you. Over to you, Paul.
Oh my goodness, I wasn't ready for that talk. I'll go right that way. Oh, right. Some things that were going through my head actually when you were talking there was, this whitewashing of women, particularly actually. But in Ireland, there's sort of famous. They produced this tea towel of all the famous Irish writers. There was no women on it, and then. Yeah, but the thing, you're sexist. Men use tea towels too, I wash dishes, okay? But the fact is, that there's this whitewashing, and also then with the commemoration of the 1916 rebellion the other year, they had this thing where they basically didn't, really include any of the women who were involved in the rebellion either, So there was this kind of real movement to recognize women, and they actually found a picture of when members of the leaders of the rebellion were being arrested. One of them was an out lesbian woman, and she was in this picture, and they'd actually taken her out of the picture. So that kind of thing happens all the time. But she was an out lesbian who lived quite openly as well, and that would have been just before the 1920s, 1916. So those were just connections were running through my head. I never worked as a waitress in a cocktail bar like yourself, or anything like that. But in terms of sexuality, I grew up in a very, male-dominated society in terms of, who called the shots, and and a very aggressive, dominant male psychology. A very violent place that Belfast was, and but I also grew alongside very, very strong women. So I did. So there was a real strange. Mixture in there, where you could argue that women were very weak because they stayed with these men. We were in a very Catholic country, where, I can't even remember when divorce was illegal in Southern Ireland, for example, right through, I think, about the 70s or something. You've got, abortion is still legal in the south of, actually, and I think in the north as well. We still have these kind of, strides to make for just, women's rights. There was recently a case, actually, I don't want to go off tangent too much, where, this girl went and took the morning after pill, and her friends that she was sharing the house with, told the police on her. She was arrested, and it's that kind of society you're living in. We're still the only place, Northern Ireland, in the UK or Southern Ireland, where gay marriage is illegal. Why is it that we're part of the UK and part of Ireland, if you want to argue that? We're both. How to be both? We're both, but we don't subscribe to either of our parent countries, or that we're supposed to be part of. That we're sort of, it's run by fundamentalists, and they deny women their rights, they deny LGBT people their rights. It's gone to the Parliament about 4 times. I think 3 or 4 times they've agreed it should be in. They've taken polls, 70% of the people want it, but they veto it every single time, and won't allow it to go through. So I'm still living in a place where, my rights aren't guaranteed. I'm not an equal citizen. I don't have the same rights as my neighbour, if they're straight, and one of the other sort of terrible, slightly gone off sexuality, terrible toxic things about Northern Ireland is that people vote against their own rights because they need to not have a Catholic MP. So they will vote for an MP that will not give them their rights, and it's astonishing, just to keep someone else out. So it's a really complex place, and it's like a really screwed up system. But I think for me, growing up around sex and sexuality, I mean, I was always fascinated by sex, even as a young boy, I mean, and a teenager. And, you know, I remember at like 16, you know, I was reading Anais Nin, you know, 17, 18, Colette, you know, and it was women I initially turned to. Women were always my strongest influence, and read their explorations of sex. And I think some of those have stayed with me the whole way through my life, you know. And I think what I loved about their work, and I remember specifically an event where I was on a tube in London. I think I was about 18 or something, and I was reading all the diaries, going through Anais Nin's diaries, and there was the one of Henry and June. She covers her lesbian relationship with June while having an affair with her husband, Henry Miller. And there was this moment where she talks about having sex and how Henry Miller, after she'd given him more sex and she still had his cum on her lips, and he kissed his cum off her lips. I thought it was one of the most extraordinary things I'd ever read, and actually still is. You know, in terms of masculinity, for example, and how what that means, and I just the intimacy of it. It wasn't that it was for me. That wasn't about sex. That was just a beautiful expression of love, of like, I'm going to strip away all your concepts of masculinity and boundaries of body and fluids, and that we are one. If you're going to take that in your mouth, I'm going to take it back. It's mine, it's yours, we're here. And I remember being absolutely, I still get tingles now, like, you know, just even remembering that moment. And I remember getting off the tube and I wasn't the same person. You know, I stood on the platform and everybody was walked past me, and I didn't know who to be from that moment. I knew that I wasn't the same person who had got on the tube, and I knew that if I wanted to engage with the world with even a tiny bit of that bravery, that I was going to have to expose myself in ways that I had never imagined before. So I think that's the wonder of sex, and I don't think we have enough discussion about the wonder of it, you know? And to me, from then on, I really did think about sex as being this, really the ultimate form of communication. It's the ultimate form of communication. Strip away language, because mostly we just talk to cover up what we really want to say. You know? We're just liars. We're actors, constantly lying, constantly stuff streaming out of our mouths, covering up what we really want to say. And then you have this opportunity in sex, you know, to take off all those masks and all those things you've decided to take on and be and represent to everyone and every person and to yourself, so you can be proud of yourself or whatever all those things. And just suddenly there you are as this organism and this thing, but it's not selfish. And that's the big difference I notice now about Tinder, Grindr, sex now. It's like, here's my menu of sexual acts I want, and I want them in this order, and I want you to say this while you're doing it, and be dressed like that, in this kind of get-up, and then I can be pleasured. And I'm like, am I involved in any way? My pleasure? Have I got anything to say? Or do you just want to send me the script? I'll learn it. I'll come in. What time show up, you know?
Can I just ask you, is that something that is articulated on Grindr?
Yeah.
Or are you sort of...
No, I mean, yeah, people will go, you know, what are you into? Or, you know, I mean, you can write it in the little boxes, which people do, because it becomes like a sex app rather than a love app or a dating app, you know? And it's like, I like these things. Well, will you just, I want you to do this. So when you come in, I want you to just do that. I don't want you to talk to, when you can you wear this? Can you do it? And it's about fantasy and things like that. And listen, there's nothing wrong with experimenting and playing around and things like that. But I think what we don't talk about enough or write about enough is the wonder of sex. There's this wondrous, miraculous thing that's pre-lingual, you know? It's pre-society, it's pre all of that, and you know, and getting back to that and connecting and the spiritual, deep eye contact type, who am I really? Not who can I pretend to be to get you off. You know?
Interesting. Thank you. Monique.
Gosh.
Monique loves sex.
Yeah.
She loves
Really exciting
she
to
writes
hear.
books on it.
Actually, really exciting to hear that image of the cum being kissed off a woman's lips. Sexy as hell. I guess for me, I've now managed to write 2 books, fiction and non-fiction, about me. And as I was saying yesterday, I've got this other list of books that are kind of literature and very safe, and everyone likes them, and they tick. It's like, that's good. But my sex books are really important to me, and they've come at a great risk. But I guess I want to go back to when I was 15. I saw Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger having sex against a wall, or I think it was under a waterfall as well. And they had that champagne cork mutual, they sort of orgasmed together, and there was that real sort of like, and they sort of did it together, and they both sort of climaxed together like that. And I was about 14 or 15, and I was just like, I can't wait for that to happen. That's amazing. If that is sex, yeah, couldn't wait. Cut to, I'm 40, and that had never happened. Not like that at all. And so I guess for me, there is a really big disconnect or gap between all the images of sex and sexuality that I had been shown and demonstrated about my pleasure by male-dominated industries like Hollywood, like the media, like porn. I had watched women orgasm like that all my life. And so, cut to when I'm about mid-30s, 40s, and I was like, there's obviously something wrong with my vagina, this is not happening. I am not, it's exciting having penetrative sex. So PIV sex, or penetrative sex, and I'm getting straight to cut to the chase, is the dominant model of heterosexual sexual pleasure. It is the dominant model. It gives men a lot of pleasure, and it's a really good way of getting women pregnant. And I would think it's really, really up for grabs whether it gives women pleasure. That sort of, grinding and fucking a woman. Let's all close our eyes and you put your hands up. Who really gets off on that? Okay, that's another big discussion. So for me, writing about sex and sexuality, everybody close your eyes, and the women in the audience who like...
Your eyes are closed, eyes are open.
I know. Anyway, so for me, that meant I was writing about a lie that I felt had been told to me, because I really doubted. I thought there was something wrong with me. Now I've talked to many, many women who, and I've listened to so many stories of women who have all kinds of sexual grief and trauma, and so I've learnt a different story, and that was important for me to write about. My quest to find my sexuality isn't about me just finding out about my own pleasure. It was a bigger exploration. So there's that. Really important to write about it. Really important to write about female sexual desire. Really important to get close to it. There's also numerous statistics, NSPCC, you name it, child protection, a charity called 1 in 4, that talks about the really high common incidence of trauma and child sexual abuse. 1 in 4 children. That's 1 in 4 adults. So if you think there's a huge disconnect between real sex, how we all really are sexually, and what we've been shown. We've been shown an awful lot of glossed over sexuality, which doesn't match our reality, which causes a lot of secrecy, shame, longing, all the things we get. I just didn't have what I thought I was going to get. And so I think we shy away from it. I was saying to Bernadine, if an alien had landed on this planet and decided to sample and read, all European and in the English language alone literature, they might assume that humans don't have sex because we don't write about it because it's problematic. So I think, for me, as not just a novelist, but as a life writing, and I teach memoir writing and think about writing. For women, there's a kind of hole in culture. We are misrepresented. Female sexual desire is not written about closely. I mean, Sabrina, you were talking about the transactional nature. That needs writing about, okay? And if you're in a position where, as Sabrina has, observed it firsthand, write it. If you have, you know, I mean, I just had this big disparity, gap between what I had been demonstrated, what had been shown, what is still always shown, and what had been my reality. That is like, we as writers, we're writing into culture, writing into that gap, really important. So that's my first kind of, having thought about this and why I have tackled sex. That would be the biggest thing it's worth writing about. But secondly, I just want to say, as a novelist, sex is full of conflict. And then we have plot. Then we have compelling narratives. And I think it's C.S. Lewis who talks about different types of love. And he talks about 4 loves, agape, caritas, philia, and eros. And other types of love are quite stable and not tricky, not so tricky. But Eros is a trickster. Eros is a trickster cherub, and he has this bow. And what happens is he goes around pulling back his arrow, and he shoots people. And he's very mischievous, and he's very devious. And we all know what it's like to have been shot by Eros's arrow, which is that moment where you go, oh my God, and you fall for someone. Okay, Eros does this. He goes into a crowded room and he'll shoot somebody. And we all know what it's like to be shot. And then, I mean, it's just great to write about, because unless the other person has also been shot by Eros at the same time, okay, you're in for a lot of stress. It's problematic. And it's just so interesting to write about this erotic charge that you are suddenly struck with. And once you have been struck, it's really there, it's been lanced. Then you have to manage it until the other person might also feel the same way. And if not, you're stuck. And then you're harboring this terrible, you've been blighted. And then you think maybe you just ignore it, wait it out, make a terrible bumbling pass or mistake, or then somebody else has been struck and they like you. And then it's just brilliant to write about, because it's unstable attachment initially. It's not stable if it's not requited, and you have to manage this. Then it all brings up your mother issues and your father issues. What you loved as a child. Are you going to be able to manage this? If you're in love and your lover doesn't love you back, or not enough, or he's in love with somebody else, and he might love you if he was free, and la 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 la. It's exciting. So that's the other reason why I think it's great plot, compelling narrative. Yeah.
Also, in your memoir, you have a section. I mean, your memoir is fascinating read, but it's also very educational. I think men and women should read it, because you explore every aspect of your sexuality. But there's a section where you're in a workshop with other women, and you discover your G-spot from another woman. Yeah. So could you tell us about this?
About that particular experience? Oh my God.
Don't be coy. Don't be coy.
So like I said, I used to be this sort of I would say I'm more of a sort of tantric hippie these days, but in those days, no. And I went to this, someone said, go to this workshop, and I hated every minute of it. It was awful, it was terrible, everyone was hugging me, and there was all sorts of touching, everything. Anyway, after about 2 days, it was relentless, try this, try that, touch my foot, touch this, touch that, do this, do that, all the time, all day, 3 hours.
It was just women?
No, men and women. And then it was like a British Council seminar. And about 2 days in, imagine about now, the men and women got separated. So the men and women got separated, and the men, all heterosexual men, had to go off with the men, it was just horrifying. Heterosexual men are so homophobic. We could just tell it was the worst torture to send a bunch of heterosexual men off together. And then the heterosexual women, we all ended up on our own, and it was exciting. We did a lot of exploration. And I'll never forget, and so my memoir is co-dedicated to 2 sex workers, and it was Damara who was there that day. And I mean, I almost fainted. And, you know, at what she was showing us, you know, bringing out all her sex toys, and then she opened her legs, and she said, and this is how I pleasure myself. And this is where my G-spot is, and then let's all find each other's G-spots. And it was just brilliant. So, I mean, it took a woman to, because, you know, Germaine Greer says that there's no such thing, but it took a woman to find my G-spot, my G-spot. I didn't even found it before. So, yeah.
Yeah, so there we go. We've all got one, apparently. Sabrina, you were talking about writing about sex. What were the issues you have when you're writing about sex? How explicit are you? What are you trying to express? What are the perhaps deeper things that you're exploring?
Well, I feel really sad now because you had such a profound, life-changing experience by reading the right kind of erotic fiction, and I just used to read Danielle Steele. And like I was about 8, because I was like a lot of the writers who've been up here this weekend, like libraries were my whole life, and my mum's collection of books was Danielle Steele, like Danielle's, that was the collection. And so when the library books ran out or I couldn't get there and I'd read through all the 8 that you were allowed to take out, I used to read those. And looking back now, I think it actually makes me realise how influential literature can be and how bad that might be in certain circumstances, because that kind of, from the little that I can remember, it was very much that sort of women's magazine type of sex, which up until very recently was all about like tricks to keep and tricks to make sure a man is enjoying himself, and not really anything at all about like how a woman felt, except for emotionally how she was feeling about this man leaving her or staying with her. So growing up with that, I think it probably influenced my my decision to work in sex industry venues, because there was something sort of quite comforting about sex being like just outright being transactional. Like, well, I mean, that's what it really is anyway. It's just a woman making a transaction that this guy is going to like her. So at least in this context, it's much more honest. And we're saying, yeah, I don't like you. I just want to get paid. And that sort of felt much more honest. Anyway, that's my little musing there on my life. Difficulties of writing about it. So, because I write in characters, like performance characters, I've never written a novel, I think in a way it's slightly easier because you're only writing in a voice. So I would only write about sex in the way that that character would talk about sex, rather than the internal thoughts of that character as they're having sex, or I don't know if that makes sense, but I think there's sometimes the unwillingness to write about sex comes from people being scared of like writing kind of cheesy sentences around how that sex is described, whereas when your character is just talking about it, it doesn't happen as much. So I haven't really found it that difficult, I guess because I've met so many women who have spoken about sex in that very open way through the places where I've worked. And that actually was one of the, when I first started, before I started not liking it, when I first worked in strip clubs, that was one of the most liberating and fantastic things, was that finally you're in a space with all these women who just spoke about like sexual stuff, whether that was like customer-based stuff or whether that was with their partners or whoever they were seeing or whatever. It was just so much more open, and there wasn't like judgment around what they were saying regarding sex, which previously I found like I didn't find that. I found like small groups of friends might do that, but like you wouldn't. I think things have changed, but it wasn't as widely spoken about. So I don't know if that's answered the question, sorry.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. And Paul, with your debut novel, your character as a child, you know, he's 10, 11, and one imagines he goes on to lead a gay life. Can you talk about the decision you made to have him growing up sort of unaware of what he was?
Yeah, actually, I don't say. He doesn't say it's in the first person. He doesn't say I'm gay, and he doesn't, and nor do I give you conclusive, proof the other way. But the suggestion is there, and certainly he's on some sort of spectrum. He's madly in love and obsessed with the girl who lives across the street for most of the book. But when he tries to make out with her, nothing really happens until he starts fantasizing. And when he first imagines kissing her, he's kissing like a rubber doll, while looking at her. And what I was playing with then is the whole idea of porn as well, and I fantasy not making up, and all these things about, there's just high rates of now of young men who have erectile dysfunction because they've watched so much porn. The real thing doesn't work for them. And there's all these kind of things that are going to become much more of a problem for society as we go on with how easy it is to access porn and the extremities that porn now goes to. So I wanted to play with that, even though it's set in a different time. That the concepts were still beginning then, of displacement and kind of fantasy over reality and things. But I think with him, I wanted to. He then goes out, and there's one, I think he goes out and he's with his teacher, and his teacher's got shorts on, and he sees hairy legs, and he's just like, oh my God, look at those hairy legs. I want a pair of those. Actually, I wouldn't mind giving him a wee feel, And so he's just kind of, because it's inside his head, and he's not telling anyone because he's a bit of a loner and he doesn't really tell anyone anything, he can just say those, he trusts himself. He's not censoring himself to himself, He hasn't taken on that kind of, no, don't do that, or don't think. He's just going to go, oh, yeah, legs, I wouldn't mind. And I think, and then later on, he sees one of the boys at school, and there's a kind of, I think he says, oh, he's like a boy Martine, meaning like you're a boy version of the girl I really like, So, and then this whole idea of the euphemism of, when the priest gives him a book and he really wants to be an actor, and he reads about Montgomery Clift being bisexual, and he's going, oh, right, so, actors can do what they want. Actors can go with men and women. I think I'm an actor, and it is part of his story that he's an actor. And so when they're all taunting him, you're gay, he says, I am not gay, I know what I am, I'm an actor. But when you think he's going to say I'm gay, or he's going to out himself, it kind of is a euphemism for being bisexual, and this idea. The whole thing about the book, there was so many things going through my head in the end when I kind of thought, when I was editing, I thought, I know the reader is going to be having a conversation with themselves the whole way through. Is this kid gay or not? And I quite liked that idea, and I didn't want to give them a definite answer, because they would keep that conversation going to the end to see whether it would be discovered. And then when it isn't said for definite, I wanted them to go away thinking, well, why are you doing that to him? Why are you doing that? You're not comfortable, are you? Because you didn't get to know, and you wanted to know what his sexuality was, and then you wanted to label him so you could turn around and say he was a gay or not, and that was what I wanted to say, just why don't you just leave him alone? And why don't you just stop doing that thing to children? Because you're just exactly like those boys, and exactly like those other people who are pointing and saying you're gay because you talk like that, and you're gay because you walk like that, you're gay because you like that show, and you're gay because you love your mum, you're gay because you're overly affectionate. And so, I want to say, well, you're doing the same thing while watching those people and criticizing them for doing it. If you're uncomfortable, and if you're constantly having this conversation about tagging him the whole way through. So that was one of the reasons why I didn't do it. There was another reason, because I spent my life in libraries, and my library didn't have an LGBT section. And then later on, when I saw LGBT sections, they were at the very back, like you were in the video shop and you wanted to go to the XXX corner. You were going to the seedy, sort of dirty part of the library where people saw you and watched. Like, and I know that some people found a lot of solace in that. I remember Gareth Grimwell, I was talking to him about it, and he was saying, that was amazing for me to go and find, there was the books for people like me, and I'd go and I'd read them all. Or it was an opposite for me, there was a lot of shame attached to all of that, so there was that part of it where, I didn't want the book to sit in an LGBT shelf and to be seen, this is not relevant to me unless I'm gay. And so I did not put it on the blurb. I made sure they didn't say anything, and then what happened is the book took on a life of its own, and then about a year and a half down the line won an LGBT award, and then became known as an LGBT book. I loved it that way, because I had my cake and I friggin' ate it, and I thought that's not to say that I don't celebrate that in it, and it's absolutely when that's what you're supposed to talk about. Someone's working on a script of it for this project, and when I met the writer, he was going, I told me all about the book, never mentioned the LGBT bit, and they'd written this script with nothing in it about that. They didn't even notice, and so now I just went, but that this is, and he went, oh my God, and I had to go back and write it. So that is really important to me. It's not like something I'm trying to airbrush out or just be more successful or all that kind of stuff. But definitely for me, I consciously made that decision as well, that I wanted to say, this is a story about growing up and not knowing, and at that moment when, anything's possible, because you're not judging yourself, and you're slightly arrogant enough to not really care what other people are saying either, because I know better than everyone else. I'm the smartest guy in town,
Still are.
Still are, thank you very much.
Okay, Monique, how was your experience of getting published with those books? And how do you feel about the publishing industry publishing sexually explicit literature?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because I was sort of thinking, I hope he's not listening, but I will say that it's really interesting. Recently, somebody read it, and he is quite well known anyway. But he Instagrammed the cover, and he said filth. He said filth, well written, but filth, and he was joking. But it's not, what he's saying is, that is a strong word, filth, even if it's meant to be a joke. So, and I was quite disappointed by even a joke about it. I just thought, come on, it's a really good book, and it took me years to write, and it did. And I was disappointed. So I think that says a lot, really. That sort of says, that was so disappointing from fellow writer, somebody I respect. That I think that kind of almost says it all.
What about the actual the people who make the decision about what gets published?
Oh well, I should say, okay, I'll just say this about the tryst. So I started writing it when I was in my 30s. It's full of shame. I wrote other books. Anyway, I came back to it, and I sold it in 2013 to my then publisher, which was a big mainstream publisher. And they'd published all my other books. And I'd survived 3 editors in 12 years. I'd been with them a long time. And so I thought they were going to publish this book. And they didn't. They got cold feet. They thought it was too sexy. I might win the Bad Sex Award. I didn't have a strong relationship with the editor at the time, but they just basically said, we've changed our mind. We don't want to publish this book. Actually, even though we bought it, they'd given me the money, a few £1,000, they said, we've changed our mind. They gave me some cock and bull, bullshit excuse, and then they said, keep the money, but we don't want to publish it anymore. And I was like, I've still got the letter. I've got the letter. They just said, keep the money, we don't want to publish it anymore. I was it's amazing. And I said to my agent, what are we going to do? She said, I'll sell it. And so we sold it again. We sold it twice. And the second time it went out, because the first time it didn't go out. I had a publisher. I just delivered it and they bought it. And then they changed their mind because it's too sexy. Anyway, so we then sent it out to everybody. Everybody turned it down. Everybody said no. Everybody said no. Everybody, like 50, 60.
What were their reasons? Do you know?
Because it's too sexy. What if I win the Bad Sex Award? You know, it's too sexy, not my cup of tea, magical realism, blah, blah, blah. And eventually we found, not eventually, but Dodo Inc., really hip, cool 3 dudes came forward and bought it and said, we can do it, we'll do it. We know who you are, we like you, we love it. It's a great book, it's a good book. We'll do it. And they did, and here I am, you know. But it was like the whole publishing industry said no. My actual publisher said yes, oh, then no. So it's been rejected. It's been outrightly rejected by every editor in the whole bloody publishing industry.
But it got brilliant reviews, right?
It's had fantastic reviews. And again, this is what I have faced before, which is nobody wants it. It's too difficult. I mean, I think that's our job, is to write wild, mad books, like really original, you know, really take risks. It's our job. It's our job. And they go, oh no, it's too wild, it's too original, it's too mad, it's too sexy. What will everybody think? What will all the mainstream people think? And but they actually like it. They're buying it. I've sold more of this book than I have of other books that were nicer and better and more literary. You know, this book has sold more than them. So I'm like, it's really screwed up. So this book has received a lot of rejection and great reviews, and it's selling. But, you know, fuck you, the industry. Yeah, really.
So,
Yeah.
Just really made me think that I've never considered how problematic female sex is thought of in the script world, really. But what you saying that's made me think. I was commissioned by a big TV station to write a show about the women who I'll read from later in How You Might Know Me in my poetry collection, for street-based sex workers. And they commissioned the whole thing like you. They bought it. They paid me like more money than I'd ever been paid for writing. I wrote it. The whole point of it was that it was funny. So it was a comedy. It wasn't this like dark, gritty drama where everyone was like lounging around on the beds with needles around, even though that was in there, but it was all funny. And that was apparently the pull. And then they did poetry monologues in the middle of it, like whilst they were having sex. They would be like talking to the camera, which has ended up being done in another show in a very different way. But anyway, so this was the reason they took it, and it all got greenlit. There was a whole team on board and everything, like actors, director, everything. And then like a few weeks before it was going to go into pre-production, they did the same thing and said, oh dear, how we've just realised actually that we have no idea how to market this to our audience, and we think it's a little bit too risky for the people who watch our channel. And it was like, how's it taken you that long to figure that out? My agent said she'd never seen anything happen like that in her entire career. And I was like, well, have you ever had anybody write a comedy about female sex workers before? She's like, no. So, well, there you go. Because people can't really put those two things together, like humour and sex that's being sold in a like non-glamorous way is like too much for them apparently. I just thought that was crazy.
Yeah, well, I feel sort of honoured to be taken seriously by the British Council, or basically by any council or any institution who want me here, because I've been slut shamed and rejected, and everybody said no, and then, you know, I get to talk about it with a bunch of, you know, it's like live streamed and it's all lovely, and this really helps. This really helps, not just me as a writer. It helps the subject. It helps this whole debate to be given a platform, and I do my best to talk about it, talk about sex and sexuality in the most kind of thoughtful way, because I just get kind of kicked into the corner as a sort of ha-ha, you know, we still have this sort of Benny Hill left over about sex, you know, ooh, don't talk about it. But, you know, so I feel even honoured just to be here and to be given any kind of platform to talk about, it's not just sort of me and my book, it's about sex and sexuality, yeah.
Great, thank you. I think we'll open it out to the audience now. Oh, all these hands going up. Great.
Oh, they love a bit of sex.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So the gentleman with the black jumper.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there were... It was interesting what you were saying about the British Sex Awards has been mentioned. And I often think it's interesting that that is something that I can't imagine that prize existing in Germany or France. There's something very British and sort of tittery about how we talk about sex. But I wondered if there were any British writers, since in this context, or British or Irish writers you guys feel write really well about sex, other than obviously you guys. But are there good books, good erotic work being published or produced in Britain or Ireland?
Well, it's not. I wouldn't probably consider it erotic, but I do think that my friend and co-writer of Offside, Holly McNeish, I think that she writes quite interestingly about female desire, because, I mean, she just does it blatantly, and she says, like, I'm not interested in any of these things that I'm supposed to be interested in. I just fantasize about a man standing in the rain with welly boots on, and like that turns me on. And I think, you know, when I first heard that, like now I'm older and like, you know, the conversations have grown a bit around it. But when I first heard that a few years ago, it was like mind blowing, because I was like, oh my gosh, you're just in public saying that like this really quite like boring thing, wellies in rain, turns you on. And she does that in loads of her work, and I think that that's something to be celebrated and built upon.
Sorry, I was just thinking. I don't read a lot of books with sex in it. I mean, I don't purposely try and avoid it or anything, but I don't think many people do. But if I thought about recent examples, I mean, Emer McBride. If I thought an even more recent example would be Irish short story writer June Caldwell. I don't know if you've heard. If you haven't heard about her, you will. She's written this collection. It did really well in Ireland, and then it was bought over by a British publisher. It's just come out by them this month, and in hardback, which again is quite rare for a short story collection. And it's been bought in America, and she's going to make huge waves. And she writes about, you know, people having kind of BDSM sort of sex dressed as kind of dogs in kitchens in farmhouses in Tipperary, you know, and it's hysterical but scary and knows no boundaries and what I love about it is, and I do. There's another thing I don't think people do enough, is that they don't put the sort of the scary with the banal enough, you know, or the sacred with the banal, you know. That sort of, you know, they're just, you know, people who go out and milk the cow and then come in and whip their husband while he's in a cage, and you know, and those people do things like that, and it doesn't make them really bad people or crazy nutcase people like serial killers. They're just kind of playing out fantasy, and they all think it's, you know, a bit of a laugh, you know, and they're doing it because they get off. And so I think that's a real eye-opening, I think, game-changing short story collection that everyone in Ireland's now just going, wow, this is going to change. There's nothing like it in Irish fiction, hasn't been probably, you know, and will start a whole new wave of writing. So I think that might be interesting.
I don't mind. Well, you see, well, first, I mean, I've got a wall of books about erotica, and a lot of it's non-fiction. So there's tons of stuff out there, from Michel Foucault to, you know, books like that have really influenced me, like The Ethical Slut. And there's tons and tons of people. Emily Witt's Future Sex. There's all sorts of memoirs out there. Zoe Margolis. So there's lots of non-fiction and lots of memoir that have really influenced me and impacted on me and liberated me. I always say Zoe Margolis, you know, thank you. You know, she just said, oh, okay, now I can do it too, and it's nice nin. But there's also some very good like literary writers who I admire. Michelle Roberts writes great sex. Hanif Qureshi is a great sex writer. We're just looking at some of the short stories this morning. Sarah Waters, Tipping the Velvet. Who else? Even Sarah Hall. You know, there's that guy, the Fermata, Nicholson Baker. There's all sorts of people who sort of really do sex and think about it and do it well. All kinds of people, you know, D.M. Thomas, all sorts of people who've, you know, the White Hotel, who've tackled sexuality and done it well. I think you can, you know, yes, there is a history of sex and fiction. My friend Rowan Pelling, who is the editor of The Amorist, she edited a collection by just a collection of short stories, short fiction, just like the Everyman Pocket Guide to Erotic Literary Fiction. It's a great collection as well. So there's all sorts of people who are, yeah, writing it well, I think.
Thank you. Let's take another question. Lady over here.
Hi. I was wondering what you make of the publishing phenomenon of 50 Shades of Grey and whether that has changed the industry's attitude towards sex. And as a follow-up, maybe if really the problem is with, you know, this idea of literature with a big L, literary fiction writing about sex, or pulp fiction, because I think there's tons of that out there. And I was just wondering what you make of that.
Well, I don't know where the industry is with the sort of 50 Shades of Grey genre at the moment. I know that it had a moment. And in fact, I know of a novelist who wrote, I think, a series of 9 books, which were based on the sort of 50 Shades of Grey phenomenon. She turned up in one of my classes, in fact. Yeah. And one of the books was written in 3 weeks, and they were always just taken by the publisher and not edited and so on. She made a lot of money. But I know that the sort of literature industry is quite condemning of 50 Shades of Grey as a work of art because it's full of cliches. You know, people don't think, it's poorly written, people don't think it's great literature. But I think that moment might have passed, I'm not sure. Do you?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it was born out of fan fiction and massive genre erotica. I mean, there's people are writing, people are writing erotica and getting really big book deals for it, and it sells by the bucket load. And I think 50 Shades grew out of that. And what else was I going to say? I think more interestingly than what the industry think about 50 Shades and if it's any good, is what it says about women, about us, about wanting to be dominated. It's all about BDSM sex. So what's going on? Much more interesting. I find a sort of societal mirror, you know, what it says about us. It's fascinating. I mean, millions and millions of copies of these terrible books have been sold. It's amazing.
Next question. Yep, lady here.
Hello, I actually had a very similar question to his, but yeah, it's still different. So all of you kind of implicitly went against what people might describe as the bad sex awards in the sense that it's, having a scene just for the purpose of titillating or just for the purpose of having it for shock value or having it be really mechanical or the usual things. But what makes an explicit scene a good scene and what makes it kind of justified within the economy of the novel? Because if you have like 5 scenes strewn one after the other, does it dilute the power of the scene that you set out to write? And how do you kind of justify it with your narrative voice that you try to embody there?
That's a very big question. So it was, I think you were saying, how do you justify having sex scenes within the architecture of a novel, and does it detract from some of the other things you're trying to explore? And how do you make it? Well, that's all open to interpretation, isn't it? Whether something's a good sex scene or not. I mean, what I haven't done is talk about my own work, and I do have sex in my work, actually. So I have a sort of S&M light scene in my verse novel Lara, which is a young woman exploring her sexuality, and I think it works within the framework of a book that stretches 150 years and 7 generations of my family history. I also have, my last novel, Mr. Loverman, is about a gay 74-year-old Caribbean man who's a Londoner, and I have some sex in that between 2 gay men in their 70s, which is touched on very lightly. I felt that I should have them having sex. And these two men have been lovers for 60 years. So, and one of them, my protagonist, Barrington, is married and has been married for 50 years. So he's basically been with his lover for even longer than he's been married. And I felt that writing that kind of gay protagonist in a novel that's within, it's a Black British novel, and Black British writers are not writing gay fiction, certainly not of that generation, that it was very important that I write the sex. I didn't go too far with it because I didn't feel confident to do that. And I went on the internet and came up against paywalls because I thought I need to see it in action. And how do you see it in action when you're not engaging with it yourself? And I couldn't see it. But it's a sort of, they have a very romantic, sexy time in a scene. And then I have his wife, who has an affair with somebody, and she has a sex scene, which is kind of, I use a lot of imagery when I write sex with my books, and that's, her relationship is with this man at work, and their sex is manifested through the stationery in the office where she's working. So she's having sex in the office, and I can't describe it any more than that, but it's done through imagery. And I'm going to read from my first novel set in Roman London, a little bit of it tonight, and I'll read a sex scene in that, which is between my protagonist, who's 18, and she's a Nubian London girl, Black London girl, living 2,000 years ago, and she has sex with the Roman emperor, who was from Libya, who was a real figure who came to London. And I think you'll see through that I'm exploring Roman colonialism through their sex, but actually it's a reflection on colonialism and power as we know it through the British context of more recent times. So, I would say that my sex scenes are quite good and that they're part of the story, they add to the story, they express things, perhaps what Monique was saying, they express things that I might not be able to otherwise express, especially with the Roman London character. And as Monique says, I feel it's an important part of who we are and how we live, and it's not something that I want to shy away from.
I mean, just briefly, I was showing in my workshop 2 short stories that were quite erotically charged, but the sex scene in both of them, one was like a line, and the other one was like 3 lines. So it was sort of very interesting piece of charged literature in both pieces. It had a lot of, feeling in it, and a lot of something was building, and then the sex scene, and they're both about sex. And I would say The Tryst is a book about celibacy within monogamy, a long-term monogamy. And again, it felt like a secret to me to address, because I was stuck in that relationship, long-term monogamous relationship that was celibate. It's a big secret. So I wanted to write about it. How on earth had I got myself into that situation? Guess what? I kept quiet about it, and but it's common. I didn't know it was common. Now I know, because I've explored it and I've written about it. So I know, and I'm out about that. Once you start, and it's just so exciting to write about stuff that you're ashamed of. It's part of why we do it. But I agree with you. Gratuitous sex scenes get a story nowhere.
I don't really have a lot to say about that. I have written some sex scenes, but they're still on my computer. And I read them to myself occasionally. But I have some alone time. I don't think I'm brave enough maybe yet to expose myself in that way, I suppose, or something. Or I'm trying to explore this idea of the sort of, this sort of sexuality with the banal and the profound, and getting that balance right. I keep waiting for my ability to match my intention. I know what I want to get, and I'm just not good enough as a writer yet to get that thing that I believe is unique. In me as a writer way that I don't see, that I think that I can achieve, that I think that I can have a vision of and create, and I'm just not good enough yet. But I think that I think definitely number one, if you're not good enough, don't do it, because there's nothing worse than reading bad sex, you know. Except people who aren't funny trying to be funny. That's really awful as well. I mean, but you know, really avoid it. And the other thing, but just sort of taking that in general about writing, is really brilliant advice I got very early on, was that every line should further the plot or reveal character. So if the scene isn't doing that, it shouldn't be there. So if you actually just take it away from all of that, and whether, you know, that's how you know whether it should be in the book, you know. And so and if you take it from the perspective of character, then what is this act revealing? Why is it happening now to this person? Why do they feel like it now? And what way did they do it that's going to reveal to us something more about them? So if you go from that angle, I think you'd be at least started.
Okay, let's take another question.
About the Bad Sex Awards. I just want to say something about the Bad Sex Awards. I agree, gratuitous doesn't advance the plot, blah, 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 and they need to be as skillful as any other bit of the plot that you write, okay. But there is this thing, the Bad Sex Awards, and this year, recently, in November, there was the Bad Sex Awards on a Thursday night, and on the Wednesday night, there was the Sexual Freedom Award. They were literally night after night. Now, the Sexual Freedom Award has also been going for about 20 years, and it was set up by someone called Tuppy Owens, and the prize you get is a winged penis. It's a gold winged penis, really kitsch. And, and it's for people, it's an industry award, it's an insider's award to people in the sex industry, in the sex positive industry, performers, strippers, sex educators, sex workers, pioneers, body workers, you name it. And it's a kitsch, a jamboree, tons of people go. But the award, people are proud of being Sex Worker of the Year. It's hilarious, kitsch award, but you get the award and it's an honor. It's an honor to win a Sexual Freedom Award. People are proud of it, okay, of their winged penis. Now, the Sexual Bad Sex Award isn't the same thing. And I think it's still a leftover of a cultured elite being able to really rib and shame somebody for writing badly about, guess what, sex. And so it's not really an honor to win the Bad Sex Award. In fact, it's a bit embarrassing, really. I wouldn't like to win one myself, and it's maybe even the reason why my book got thrown back at me, just in case I did. But there's that sort of, still that's kind of, look at this bad sex. And I'm not going to name names, but somebody who was nominated this year has written a great book, a huge book. He took also a decade to write. And they must have ploughed through it to find the one sex scene in the book to nominate him. There was some kind of personal animal. So I think, do we need these funny cultured elites going, let's shame somebody for writing sex bad. Let's shame a good writer for writing a bad sex scene. I don't know. I feel I'd much rather a winged penis, to be honest, and an honourable award.
That's so interesting because, that it used to be called the Erotic Awards. That it used to be called the Erotic Awards, that Tuppy does. And that was the first award that I was ever nominated for as a poet, Best Erotic Poet. And I was like, what? I don't think I do erotic poetry. Like, I just am talking about, like, strippers and stuff. And she was like, yeah, but we love it. So I went there and I took my mum and my uncle because it was the first thing I'd ever been nominated for. And they were like, what is going on? Because obviously it's like everyone was in their outfits and there's like corners of people like getting with each other and stuff on these like bean bags. And my mum was like, well, I'm just going to get a wine. And I was like, okay, yeah, I mean, but it was so, like you said, it was such a fun, like positive atmosphere. But interestingly, Ernesto, the naked poet, actually won that one. He gets fully naked on stage, so he was definitely more erotic than me. But that's the one award that I've been nominated for that I haven't ever put it on like my bio or like my CV when people have asked me, you know what, I'm going to now. But it's just you saying that has made me remember that at the time I thought this isn't something to publicise because I was getting asked to do a lot of like then sex-focused events, and I just felt like that wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do, and that the word erotic meant that people always thought of you in that way. So I was trying to, at that time, kind of steer myself to a more general thing. But, yeah, thanks.
Sorry, quickly. So this woman that Bernadine and I know, I went to a sex party one night, and there's a very little crossover between writers and the sex-positive world, and that award doesn't have writing anymore. So there's no good sex award, which is really sad. I think there needs to be a good sex award. So I went to the sex club one night, and there was all sorts of hilarious acts, people doing all kinds of things, dressing up as animals, very funny. And then this woman came on with a red leotard and a big bun, big bun. She had red hair, and she was just knockout cool. She read a poem, and she was just, I mean, literally afterwards, I sort of said, do you write? And she's like, no, it's my first thing. I said, wow. And anyway, she ended up doing a course, and what I like about her books, as opposed to the 50 Shades of Grey, is they come from inside a sex-positive community. She's sort of like an insider with lots to say, and so I think I'm hoping there is going to be more and more people who have some kind of. I just feel we need to liberate each other and to approach writing about sex with pride, and whether you're an insider, you've been working in a sex club, or you're part of a sex-positive community or a tantric community, or you're curious, I feel so, sure that we need this Good Sex Award, and for everybody to start writing.
Great. Okay, next question. So we have a few hands up. The lady here, Cortina.
I wanted to go back a bit to the question about the challenges of getting published, and really wondered, I mean, it's a general thing, and sort of both Paul and Sabrina have talked about sort of not necessarily wanting their work to be identified with a particular assumption about that may come either from being categorized in a certain way or having won a certain award. And I was wondering, Monique, whether you felt that the Tryst was a real step change for you, whether, I mean, because actually we haven't in the last day or two talked very much about your other work, your other writing, and whether the Tryst is something that is a direction that you're going forward with, or whether you see yourself writing. Because I'm just interested in the publisher reaction. I mean, I've been a publisher, so I tend to sort of try and see things both ways. And I did wonder whether they were concerned that their brand, Monique Roffey Fiction, was going to be really challenged by the change in direction that you'd make, and that, because there is an element, the way publishers publish authors, there's about, you have a marketing style, you have a cover style, and it's all about encouraging people to read the next book. And whether they felt challenged, or that their writers might have been challenged by a direction that you're taken with the Tryst.
Okay, I don't know, because I feel as though we writers, or me in particular, I never think about making commercial decisions about what is going to be the brand. Is just like the last thing I've ever thought about. So I just produce these books that I feel are really important to me, and I don't really do any of the adding up like the publisher does. So there may have been, it may be that I have readers who expect this and want this, and then they're incredibly disappointed about the fact that I've done this as well. But the Tryst has a lot of sex in it, but there is a story about celibate marriage at the heart of it, which felt like a really interesting narrative story to delve into. I think I'm going to really think about if I write a third book or any more sexy books. I'm post-menopause, so that's been really interesting. And not many women, I mean, how many 50-something women do we see as sort of sexual creatures in popular culture? In books, films, anything really. How many women get to own their sexuality after a certain age? I think that's really interesting. I'm going to have to think about that. So I don't want to be worried about book deals. The minute you worry about whether somebody is, if you're pleasing your publisher, let alone your readers, then get out of the game. Get out of the game.
Okay, Ingrid.
Hello. thank you that you mentioned older women. I'm much older than you are, so I'm really curious what you would be writing about it. Yeah, because that is no topic anywhere, you know, what you do with your sex when you're older. But what I really wanted to say that I find there is a great contradiction. On the one hand, we have pornification of society. I mean, a lot of feminists are now writing about it. Penny Laurie, Natasha Walker, what's it called? The book was, the title was Girls. Oh God, I forgot the title. Anyway, it is about, it's a warning that all the pornography on the internet is spoiling young people's first discovery of sex, and that the old pattern, you know, the dominant male and the compliant female is the model, and that the girls, the worry of many feminists is that the girls sort of try to live up to these expectations roused in all this filthy pornography, you know, you can see on the internet, and which schoolgirls and schoolboys are looking at on their mobiles, etc. So I think it's amazing that publishers should be so fussy about literary, well-written scenes about sex. For me, it is a great contrast. You know, you have it everywhere in advertising, on the internet. But it's always this one kind. Is it perhaps because if it's sex scenes written from the female perspective, or that is more difficult to get across? I don't know.
Hasn't sold, hasn't made me rich.
Yeah, but,
Just as a very quick response to the much put out decision that pornography is like ruining young people's lives. I work with young people all the time, do school workshops all the time, and there is definitely two extremes in that every school I work in has pretty much got a feminist society in which girls aged 12 to 18 are fully active in, whilst also being like very streetwise girls. They're not like middle class or anything like that, and they are part of this feminist society, and they feel strongly about their own sex lives and what they're going to do about them and how they're going to go about them. And then there is this whole other extreme where, yes, girls are like completely just fulfilling this like pornographic ideal that's been put up there. But I do feel that these other girls who are quite I don't know, there was no feminist societies in my school when I was young. I didn't know anyone who was feminist till I was like 22. So I think that the idea that all young people are sort of now like diminished in any ability to kind of navigate their way through a pornography-filled world is not accurate at all, and is like really dispiriting to think that that's how they're being thought of when they're quite amazing at being able to recognise what is something that appeals to them and something that isn't. But yeah, that's a whole other thing.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more question, I think. Young lady here.
Hi. So just shortly, do you think secrecy and prohibition can make sex better? And what do you think about that? And what do you think about writing about that, or how that influences it? I don't know if I...
Do you think that secrecy and prohibition makes sex better, did you say?
Maybe, yeah. Like there, I think there's something secret about sex.
Mysterious.
Something mysterious, and like something about like not being allowed to do certain things, and maybe not even talking about them to anyone else except certain situations that actually make it better.
So for example, if it's not in literature, are you arguing that it's perhaps better because it's something that continues to be mysterious and secret?
Not necessarily. I was just thinking about it. Like maybe even in literature, that could be conveyed as well.
So like in real life? We're talking in real life as well?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting because I was reading something recently about, this gay sort of complaining that it wasn't the same anymore, the thrill. you know, of kind of clandestine, these kind of, having to go out to a forest at night, because, you couldn't be, it was illegal to be gay, and so that your sexual experience became wrapped up with sort of fear, the fear of being caught, and so that it brought like an extra tension, an extra physical sensation that heightened everything that happened, and people talk about, how, there's a sanitization of gay life now, but I think that, just because, you were forced to do something, and it brought an extra thrill, it doesn't mean that it's better or right. It may have been more thrilling, and for a generation of people that so I'm talking very specifically about, gay sex when it was illegal and blah, blah, blah. That it's maybe a generational thing, but that was something that came up recently, that in fact the secrecy did in fact bring a sort of an extra sensationalism of sex and an extra excitement. But I personally think that just because it was wrapped up in fear, and it brought that thrill, I don't think that's necessarily your goal in life. I think it was just circumstantial, and some thrills aren't meant to be had. But anyway, that was just a thought.
Okay, so we'll just take actually one more question. The gentleman had his hand up at the back.
I was actually going to ask a sort of related question to Ingrid's question, which is that pornography is a form of fiction, and it's a pervasive form of fiction that we that society is available at a click. So if this is the most common representation of the actual sex act that people encounter besides what they do themselves, then if you go to literature, do you feel there's a certain kind of burden of representation as well, because this is also another form of fictional sex that you are representing for people who otherwise wouldn't see beyond their own bedroom?
Somebody want to answer this? So he was saying that the most pervasive form of people witnessing sex is pornography. So is there a burden of representation when people write sex because they feel that they have to represent it in a certain way?
Oh, I don't know. I think I'll quite like to have a go at that. Well, I think, yes, you're right about porn. There is, it is the way that most people watch it, I think, because we don't necessarily watch each other. So there is this problem with, am I on the right track with answering this? So there is this problem of sort of fake sex. We're watching a lot of fake sex or staged sex, which is often, coerced or whatever. I mean, interestingly, I was watching some, people are now live streaming the sex. I mean, I watched this porn hub the other day, and there were couples like, me and my boyfriend, or, people posting videos of their set, of what they were doing in bed. I was like, okay. Anyway, but so what is it? What are we watching? I don't know. But I just think it's, sex is a really interesting, complex, submerged part of our persona and our life. I just did a workshop, try. It's the one thing I think you've got to be careful about: writing what you don't know, writing fantasy, writing stuff you've seen, writing stuff you wish you'd done, writing stuff you'd like to do and you haven't tried, trying to guess what it might be like to be gay if you're not, or trying to guess what it might be like to be this or that, or whatever it is. I think sex is the one area where I would say maybe start writing what you know, what's true, what's close, what's relevant, and you'll inevitably stumble across quite difficult material, to be honest. And then that's fine, just start there. But I think the sort of high energy, overblown, happy sex, good sex, which means men orgasm by penetrating women, that's the model, and the women go, I'd be very careful about writing that.
I think we'll end it on that.